Welcome to Under Baobab Skies. Tonight, let the rhythm of our story be set not by a drum, but by another, older percussion. Listen, clack, clack, clack. It is the sound of wood meeting wood, of thread being tensioned, of a shuttle flying through a forest of vertical lines. This is the sound of the loom. Not a small, portable frame, but the great, upright loom of the Wolof people of Senegal. It is a sound as constant in the villages as the wind through the acacia trees, as the murmur of the nearby Atlantic surf. It is the sound of time being measured not in hours, but in wefts and warps. The sound of stories being not told, but woven. In these villages, cloth was never just a covering. It was a container, a living, breathing archive. The threads were timelines. The vertical warp threads represented the unchanging lineage, the constant we have always been. The horizontal weft threads captured the events of a life, the choices, the days, woven in to create the fabric of a person, a family, a history. The patterns were not mere decoration. They were proverbs made visible, ethics rendered in geometry. A zigzag might warn of a treacherous path. A series of interconnected diamonds might speak of the unbreakable bonds of community. To wear a certain cloth was to carry a library on your shoulders, to sleep under a blanket that was also a book of laws. Tonight we will enter this world of woven wisdom. We will meet a loom so vast and complex it required for generations to operate a child's quick hands, a mother's steady guidance, a grandmother's memory for color, a great-grandmother's knowledge of proverbs, all working in concert to create a single strip of meaning. We will witness the weaving of a final, profound text, the funeral cloth that encodes an entire life story, a textile biography laid to rest with its subject. We will feel the rupture of colonialism as cheap, foreign cloth silenced the looms, and hear of the desperate, brilliant decision to weave secret protests into the very fabric the colonizers admired. And finally, we will join a new generation of Senegalese designers as they decode their grandmother's work with magnifying glasses, discovering hidden messages and weaving a bold, beautiful future from reclaimed threads of the past. This is a story about memory as a tangible thing, about resistance that is soft to the touch but unyielding in its meaning, about the incredible intelligence embedded in tradition and intelligence so deep it could hide in plain sight for a century, waiting for the right eyes to see it again. As we begin, let us imagine the feel of hand-spun cotton, the smell of indigo dye vats, the focused silence of the weaver's shed, broken only by the rhythmic clack and the soft, guiding voices of generations. Let's pause for a moment. The fire crackles gently as the night breathes around us. In the distance, let that rhythmic clack 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 become the heartbeat of our story. Steady, patient, weaving the night air itself into a tapestry of dreams. The heart of this woven world was the family loom, an heirloom often larger than the room that housed it. It wasn't just a tool. It was a member of the family, a silent elder that connected the living to the ancestors. Weaving was a communal act, a symphony of hands and minds. At the base, a young child, perhaps only 5 or 6 years old, would be tasked with the simplest job, passing the shuttle back and forth. Their small, quick fingers were perfect for the task. And through this simple repetition, they learned the fundamental rhythm of creation. Above them sat their mother. Her hands were strong and sure, guiding the heddles, the wooden bars that lifted and lowered the warp threads, creating the shed through which the shuttle would fly. She was the engine of the loom, her movements steady and powerful, setting the pace. Beside her, or perhaps behind her, was the grandmother. Her eyes, though perhaps not as sharp as they once were, held the library of colors. She knew which plants yielded the richest indigo, which roots gave a deep ochre, how to mix them to create shades that spoke of joy or mourning or royalty. She was the keeper of the palette, ensuring the story was told in the right emotional tones, and overseeing them all. The great-grandmother, she might not touch the loom at all anymore. Her role was purely intellectual, purely spiritual. She was the custodian of the proverbs, the patterns, the deep grammar of the cloth. She would call out the sequence of colors and shapes, reciting from memory the ancient codes that turned simple geometry into profound philosophy. 3 rows of the broken path, she might say, followed by one of the united family. Each instruction was a line of poetry, a piece of ancestral advice. Together, these 4 generations didn't just make cloth, they wove time itself. The child represented the future, the mother the present, the grandmother the recent past, and the great-grandmother the deep, mythic past. The cloth that emerged from their hands was a physical manifestation of this continuity, a tangible link across a century of lives. And when a life reached its end, the loom would be called upon for its most sacred task. The funeral cloth, or Suryu Rab in Wolof, was the final masterpiece. It was a textile biography. The weavers would gather, and over days of patient work, they would encode the story of the departed onto a single, magnificent piece of fabric. The number of stripes might indicate the number of children they had. A specific diamond pattern could represent a great act of generosity. A subtle shift in the indigo's shade might speak of a period of hardship overcome. This cloth was not meant to be read by the living, but to be presented to the ancestors, a passport and a final report for the life that had been lived. It was wrapped around the deceased, a final embrace of woven memory, before being laid to rest, returning story to the earth. Then came the rupture. The arrival of colonialism in the 19th and early 20th centuries brought with it machine-made textiles from Europe, brightly colored and mass-produced. These foreign fabrics flooded the markets. Suddenly, the slow, sacred work of the loom couldn't compete economically. The rhythmic clack began to fall silent in one village after another. The great looms were dismantled, the knowledge of the patterns began to fade, and the grandmother's proverbs were left unspoken. A centuries-old library was on the verge of being lost forever. But the spirit of resistance found a new, secret language, while the colonizers admired what they saw as primitive. Decorative patterns on the remaining Wolof cloths, the weavers began to embed messages of protest right under their noses. They developed a clandestine system of symbols. A seemingly innocent geometric motif might actually be a stylized depiction of a broken chain. A specific arrangement of colors could be a coded message calling for unity against the occupiers. They wove their dissent into the very fabrics the colonial administrators and their families would buy and display in their homes. The cloth became a silent, beautiful act of rebellion. The weavers were hiding their defiance in plain sight, using their ancestral art form as a weapon that was soft, pliable, and completely undetectable to the uninitiated eye. This intelligence, this quiet courage, ensured that even as the looms were being silenced, the spirit of the Wolof people was being woven, thread by thread, into a tapestry of resilience that would endure. Today, a new generation is picking up those threads. In the bustling markets of Dakar and the quiet villages of the countryside, a renaissance is underway. Young Senegalese designers, artists, and historians are now turning back to their heritage, not as a relic of the past, but as a blueprint for the future. They are visiting their elders, sitting with their grandmothers, and using magnifying glasses to study the antique cloths preserved in family homes and museums. They are not just copying the patterns, they are decoding them. They are relearning the lost language of the loom, rediscovering the proverbs, the histories, and the secret acts of defiance hidden in the geometry. And they are creating something entirely new. You can see it in contemporary Senegalese fashion. where a traditional pattern might be reimagined on a modern silhouette. You can see it in art installations where woven panels hang like ancient scrolls, telling new stories for a new century. They are blending the hand-spun cotton with new materials, the natural indigo with bold contemporary colors. They are taking the wisdom of the four-generation loom and translating it for a global audience. They are proving that tradition is not a static object to be preserved behind glass, but a living, breathing force that can be adapted, reinvented, and made relevant for today. The clack of the loom is returning, not just as an echo of the past, but as the powerful, rhythmic heartbeat of a vibrant and creative future. Thank you for joining us under Baobab Skies tonight. If this story of woven wisdom resonated with you, please subscribe and share. Your support helps us keep these incredible histories alive. We'll meet again soon. You are now under Baobab Skies. By the end of this part, you'll understand why the great Wolof loom was not merely a tool, but a living institution, a physical manifestation of the belief that true creation requires the synchronized wisdom of the past, present, and future, and that no single lifetime is sufficient to hold the knowledge of the cloth. Imagine a tool that's not just a tool, but a living, breathing institution, a physical manifestation of the belief that true creation isn't a solo act, but a symphony played by the past, present, and future. This is the story of the great Wolof loom, a testament to the idea that the knowledge of the cloth is too vast for any single lifetime to hold. The loom itself was a commanding presence. Picture this, nestled in a shaded, open-sided shelter within a family compound, a colossal structure rises from the earth. It's crafted from massive, polished, dark wood, something like Kea or Ko El Sidrat, so deeply rooted it feels like part of the architecture, as permanent as the family hearth. You wouldn't dream of moving it. Its vertical posts soar higher than a person, supporting a complex skeleton of crossbeams, heedle frames, and the great cloth beam where the masterpiece slowly grows. To an outsider, it looks like a beautiful, bewildering jungle of threads and wood. But to the weaving family, it's a map of knowledge. Every single part, every beam, and every thread corresponds to a different realm of understanding, a different chapter in their story. Sunlight slants in through the open sides, illuminating the intricate web of warp threads stretched taut from the ceiling to the floor, waiting to be brought to life. It's not just a machine. It's a sacred space. The philosophy behind this magnificent loom is both simple and incredibly profound. The creation of meaningful cloth was considered too important, too sacred, to be left to one mind or one pair of hands. It was a collective act of memory and prophecy. The loom demanded a chorus, a collaboration spanning for generations, each playing a specific, irreplaceable role. This wasn't about efficiency. It was about integrity. Let's start with the future, represented by a child, maybe 6 or 7 years old. Their small, nimble fingers are tasked with passing the shuttle, that small boat carrying the thread back and forth. They scurry to pick up dropped threads, their movements quick and instinctive. They are learning the rhythm of the loom in their very bones long before they can comprehend it in their minds. Their role is one of pure physicality and absorption. They are the hands of time yet to come, touching the thread for the first time, their youthful energy woven into the fabric's foundation. They are the promise of continuity. Now, let's move to the present. The mother, in the prime of her life, is the conductor of this orchestra. She sits at the very heart of the operation. Her feet dance on the treadles, raising and lowering the headballs, separating the warp threads to create what S called the shed, the magical opening through which the shuttle flies. With focused calm, she guides the emerging pattern, row by intricate row. Her hands catch the shuttle and send it back on its journey. She ensures the tension is perfectly even, the beats of the reed consistent and strong. Her role is one of execution and management. She is the one turning the blueprint of the past into the tangible reality of the now. She is the weft, the active thread weaving the day-to-day life of the family into the enduring warp of their lineage. She weaves the present moment into history. But where does the color, the lifeblood of the design, come from? For that, we turn to the grandmother. She holds the palette of memory. She doesn't sit at the loom itself, but nearby, a wise queen surrounded by her court of baskets, each overflowing with skeins of thread. Her knowledge is of color, but not just any color. She knows the exact, perfect shade of indigo that can only be achieved from the third fermentation of the dye vat. She knows the rich, earthy ochre found in a specific clay bed that reveals itself only after the first rains. She knows how to brew a subtle, deep black from boiled acacia pods. Her wisdom is profound. She remembers which colors will gently fade over time into a soft, sage-like wisdom, and which will hold fast to their youthful vibrancy. Defying the sun, she selects the threads for each section of the pattern based on a deep, internalized sense of harmony and meaning. This isn't knowledge from a book. It's built from a lifetime of watching the sun change the cloth on people's backs, seeing how the colors live and breathe with the wearer. She is the guardian of the visual language, the curator of the cloth's soul. Finally, in the deepest shade, often on a low stool, sits the great-grandmother. She is the anchor to the most distant past. Her eyes might be clouded with age, but her inner vision is as sharp as ever. She rarely touches the threads anymore. Her instrument, now, is her voice. She is the librarian of proverbs, the keeper of the moral and philosophical codes that are the very reason for the cloth's existence. As the mother weaves, the great-grandmother speaks, not constantly, but at precise, meaningful moments. Her voice might be a dry rustle, like leaves in a gentle breeze, but her words carry immense weight. Here, she might say, "Here, we will weave the proverb of the baobab and the grass. The storm bends the grass, but it uproots the proud tree." And the mother, without needing further explanation, understands. She shifts the pattern. She incorporates a specific sequence of triangles to represent the storm, a flowing, undulating line to symbolize the bending grass, and a strong, central column with a split, broken top to depict the uprooted tree. The great-grandmother provides the asterisk, why, asterisk, she gives the cloth its purpose, its narrative soul. The others, in perfect harmony, collaborate on the asterisk, how asterisk, the child's hands, the mother's action, the grandmother's colors, and the great-grandmother's wisdom. 4 are essential. None could create this cloth alone. Together, across 4 generations, they translate abstract wisdom into wearable, usable art. The great Wolof loom was not a machine for making fabric. It was a vessel for carrying knowledge, a living library where every thread tells a story. And the act of weaving is a prayer spoken by the hands of a family, a prayer that echoes through time. To watch them work was to witness a slow, beautiful dance, a choreography perfected over centuries. It all begins not with the loom itself, but with the child. Imagine a little girl, we'll call her Aminata, being given her very first basket of freshly spun thread. Her first and most sacred duty is to walk the walk. Under her grandmother's gentle guidance, she walks back and forth, again and again. In the open space before the loom, she loops the thread around to distant posts, creating the long, parallel lines that form the very foundation of the cloth. This isn't just a task, it's meditation in motion. It teaches her patience. It teaches her the length of a single thought. It embeds deep within her muscles the fundamental structure. the unchanging verticals upon which all the stories of her people will be hung. Once this warp is wound onto the loom's great back beam and threaded through the heddles with immense day-long task, often done by the mother and grandmother together, the daily weaving can finally begin. Aminata takes her place on a small stool right beside the loom. Her job is now shuttle runner. When her mother calls out, "Pass," Aminata takes the shuttle from one side and, with a swift, smooth motion, passes it through the open space in the threads, called the shed, to her mother's waiting hand on the other side. This is a task of pure timing and trust. If she's too slow, the shed will close, trapping the shuttle. If she's too forceful, it might fly out and tangle the delicate threads. In this simple, repetitive act, she learns the rhythm of collaboration, the familiar feel of the tool in her hand, the specific sound of work done correctly. The mother, let's call her AWA, is the engine of this entire operation. Her feet, calloused and strong from years of this work, dance on the treadles in a sequence she knows purely by feel. Clack clack goes the left foot, and the shed opens. Aminata passes the shuttle. Swish thump as AWA beats the new weft thread tightly into place with the heavy reed. Then, clack clack goes the right foot, opening the opposite shed. The shuttle returns. Each cycle is like a breath. Each row of thread is like a sentence being written. Her focus is absolute, because even a moment elapse in the pattern sequence would create a flaw in the proverb being woven, a stutter in the story being told. She holds the present moment with an intense sense of responsibility, knowing the hands of the past and the future are literally in her care, woven into the very fabric she creates. Let's just pause for a moment. Imagine the scene. Maybe a small fire is crackling nearby as the night begins to breathe around them. Picture that dance, the child's swift, darting movement, the mother's powerful, rhythmic pedal work, the grandmother's contemplative selection of a new color from her basket, and perhaps the great-grandmother's silent observation, her eyes holding generations of knowledge, waiting for the right moment to speak the next line of the ancient code. It's a symphony in four-part harmony, a living, breathing connection across time. The grandmother and I watches the growing cloth with a discerning eye. When the pattern dictates a color change, she doesn't simply hand a new skein to AWA. No, she holds it up to the light, feeling its weight, comparing it to the colors already woven into the cloth. She might say something like, "The indigo is too proud here. It needs the humility of the ash dye gray at its edge." She understands that colors speak to each other. They argue, they comfort, they balance one another, just like the people who will one day wear this cloth. Her choices are not merely aesthetic, they are diplomatic. She is ensuring the visual proverb has the correct emotional and moral tone. In this way, she is the translator, bridging the gap between the intangible idea of the proverb and the tangible, vibrant hue of the thread. As Aminata grows, her role evolves. The simple act of passing the shuttle has trained her eyes and hands. She starts to notice the subtle shifts in tension, the way one color meets another. Her mother, Awa, might start to explain the patterns, not in words, but by guiding her daughter's hand over the emerging cloth. "Feel this?" she might murmur. "This is the crossing of paths, where two families meet." Or, "This tight weave here, this is the secret kept, strong and unbreakable." Aminata is no longer just a bell runner. She is an apprentice, absorbing the language of the loom through touch and rhythm. She learns that a loose thread is not just a mistake. It's a whisper of a story that wasn't told correctly. Meanwhile, Awa continues her powerful, steady work, but her role is also that of a teacher. She is the bridge between the past, embodied by her mother, Endai, and the future, embodied by her daughter Aminata. While her feet move with unconscious skill, her mind is cataloguing every detail. She knows which patterns are for weddings, which for funerals, which for celebrating a good harvest. She remembers the stories her own grandmother told her as she learned at the loom. Tales of clever spiders, wise tortoises, and the origins of their people. These stories are not just entertainment, they are the keys to the patterns, the very soul of the cloth. She weaves them in, row by row, ensuring they are not forgotten. And Endai, the grandmother, the keeper of colors, she does more than just select the dyes. She is the living archive. When a new proverb needs to be woven, one that hasn't been created in years, it is Neddy who recalls its structure. She closes her eyes and her fingers trace invisible patterns in the air, remembering the sequence, the color shifts, the number of threads required for each symbol. She is the quality control, the spiritual guide of the entire process. She can spot a misplaced thread from across the room. She can feel a change in the cloth's tension just by listening to the sound of the loom. Her approval is the final seal on the work, a confirmation that tradition has been honored, that the story has been told truly. Imagine the day Aminata is finally allowed to sit at the main loom. It's a momentous occasion. Her small feet might barely reach the treadles. Awa sits beside her, not as the engine anymore, but as the guide. Her hands rest lightly on Aminata's, her voice a calm instruction in her ear. Easy now. Feel the rhythm. Let the loom speak to you. The first few rows are clumsy, the beat uneven, but then something clicks. The muscle memory from years of watching, of passing the shuttle, of walking the warp, all comes together. The clack-clack, swish-thump becomes her own. For the first time, she is not just part of the dance. She is leading a step. In that moment, she understands. She understands that the thread running through her fingers is the same thread that ran through her mother's, her grandmother's, her great-grandmother's. It's a physical, unbroken line connecting her to every woman in her lineage who ever sat at a loom. The patterns are not just pretty designs. They are a library of wisdom, a collection of shared history, a way of speaking without words. The cloth they create is more than just a garment or a blanket. It's a storybook, a legal document, a piece of a collective soul made tangible. It's a testament to the power of collaboration, patience, and the beautiful, intricate dance of passing knowledge from one generation to the next. This is how a culture keeps itself alive, not in dusty books, but in the vibrant, living threads of a loom. The true test of this incredible four-generational system was not just in making beautiful cloth, but in weaving something far more profound into it. A complete proverb, a piece of ancestral wisdom made tangible. Let's follow the creation of one such proverb, a common teaching meant to check arrogance. Borumzel Dol, the owner of money, is not the owner of wisdom. The entire process would start long before anyone even sat at the loom. It began in the mind of the great-grandmother, Yasi. She would recall the proverb, letting it settle in her thoughts. Then she would begin to deconstruct it, not into words, but into its core conceptual components. She'd think about money, seeing it as transient and cold. She'd contemplate wisdom, viewing it as enduring and warm. And critically, she'd consider the negation, the knot that stands between them, the great divide. She wouldn't write this down. Instead, she would describe these ideas in shapes and relationships, a visual language passed down from her own great-grandmother. She might close her eyes, her bony finger tracing patterns in the air as she explained it to her daughter. Money, she might say, is like small, hard squares, like cowrie shells, but closed off. They should sit together in a tight, glittering cluster. But wisdom is an open spiral, like the unfolding of a new fern frond. Its lines must be soft, and they should lead outwards towards the edges of the world. The next link in this chain was the grandmother, and I. Her task was to translate this ethereal, visual description into a concrete color scheme. Listening to her mother's words, she would select the threads. For the money squares, she'd choose a thread dyed with a special mineral pigment. Something metallic that would catch the light but feel cool to the touch if you ran your fingers over it. It had to glitter, but with a cold fire. For the wisdom spiral, her choice would be completely different. She'd select a deep, warm indigo, a color that seemed to absorb light and hold it deep within its fibers. A color of the midnight sky full of stars. To draw the unfolding lines of the spiral, she would contrast this with a rich, earthy ochre. The colors themselves had to tell the story, to visually express the proverb's meaning. The stark difference between cold, isolated glitter and deep, connective warmth. With the concepts visualized and the colors chosen, the work finally moved to the loom, into the hands of the mother. Edouard, she would receive these intricate instructions from her mother and grandmother. Her skill was in the physical act of creation. She knew the precise sequence of weft threads to pass and the exact rhythm of pressing the treadles with her feet to create the patterns. She would weave the small, isolated diamonds that represented money. Then she would shift her technique to form the long, flowing, graceful curves of the wisdom spiral. But between these two distinct patterns, she would do something incredibly important. She would weave a clear, deliberate gap of plain, unpatterned cotton. This empty space was not an absence of design. It was a core part of it. This gap was the visual representation of the word, not the separation, the negation. It was just as crucial to the proverb's meaning as the intricate patterns on either side of it. And then there was the child, the great-granddaughter Aminata. Her job was to pass the shuttles, those wooden carriers of thread, back and forth to her mother. As she did, her small body would feel the rhythm of the loom change. She wouldn't understand the abstract meaning of the proverb yet, but her muscles would learn its cadence. The clack-clack for the diamonds of money would be sharp, quick, contained, a tight, repetitive beat. But when her mother began weaving the wisdom spiral, the rhythm would slow, becoming a longer, more fluid sequence. A clack, followed by a long swish, and then another clack. She was learning the muscle memory of a moral lesson. Her body was absorbing the idea that acquisitiveness, the gathering of money, is a tight, frantic rhythm, while wisdom is a slower, more expansive, and more graceful one. When the long strip of cloth was finally finished, it would be carefully cut from the loom, washed in cool water, and laid out to dry. Then it would be presented back to where it all began, to Yasini, the great-grandmother. Her eyesight might be failing, but her hands were her eyes. She would run her weathered fingertips over the cloth, reading the raised patterns like a sacred text. She would feel the cold, bumpy clusters of the diamonds. Then her fingers would trace the smooth, sweeping, open path of the spiral. A slow, deeply satisfied smile would spread across her face. The translation was complete. The abstract idea had been made concrete. A philosophical concept, a guide for living, now existed in the physical world as a thing that could be touched, worn on a sash, traded as a gift, and eventually passed down to the next generation. Aminata, the young child, would reach out and touch the finished cloth. And here, her real education would begin. She would start to connect the rhythm her body had learned at the loom to the visual pattern her eyes now saw. And one day, listening to the stories of her elders, she would connect both of these experiences to the verbal proverb her mind would finally comprehend. The loom hadn't just made a piece of cloth. It had performed a multi-sensory, intergenerational lesson in ethics. It had woven a family, a history, and a philosophy into a single, beautiful thread. Let's just pause for a moment here. and imagine that scene. The fire crackles gently in the background as the cool night breathes around them. Think of the profound completion of that cycle. An idea born in the ancient mind of an elder is given the color of memory by her daughter, then shaped into form by the skilled hands of her granddaughter, and finally its very rhythm is absorbed into the body of her great-granddaughter. Knowledge becomes substance, right there in the quiet, shaded loom shed. An entire worldview, not written in a book, but woven into the fabric of their lives. This wasn't just about preserving a saying. It was about ensuring that the values within that saying were understood on every possible level, intellectually, visually, and kinesthetically. Each generation played a unique and irreplaceable role. The elder held the conceptual wisdom, the grandmother held the aesthetic and emotional translation, the mother held the technical skill of manifestation, and the child held the future, absorbing the lesson unconsciously, preparing to one day become the keeper of the concept herself. The cloth became a living document. Wearing it was a constant, gentle reminder of the values it represented. When Aminata grew older and wore a sash with this pattern, she wouldn't just be wearing a decorative item. She would be wearing a piece of her great-grandmother's mind, her grandmother's heart, and her mother's hands. When she felt the different textures under her fingers, she would be reminded of the different rhythms of life, the frantic pursuit of wealth versus the slow, steady cultivation of wisdom. This tradition shows us a way of knowing that is so much deeper than just reading words on a page. It's a holistic education where art, ethics, and family are inseparable. The proverb, "The owner of money is not the owner of wisdom," wasn't just a clever phrase. It was a physical reality they created together, a truth they could literally hold in their hands. The loom was their school, the threads were their alphabet, and the finished cloth was their shared textbook, a story of who they were and what they believed. Passed on not just from mind to mind, but from hand to hand to hand to hand. In the vibrant tapestry of Wolof life, death was never seen as a final, abrupt end. Instead, it was a profound translation. Imagine it as a story, moving from the world of speech and action, of breath and heartbeat, into the silent, enduring realm of cloth and memory. This wasn't about closure. It was about continuation in a different form. And at the heart of this transition was a sacred tradition, a final act of honor woven with cotton and story. The embab udik, the funeral shroud. When an elder, a person rich in years and experience, felt their time on earth was drawing to a close, a unique and somber process would begin within their family. The weavers, the keepers of the loom, would be called upon for their most sacred commission. This wasn't a rushed preparation driven by grief. It was a deliberate, mindful act of profound respect. The goal was to weave the person's final, definitive portrait, not with paint on canvas, but with intricate patterns on cloth. The entire process began not with thread, but with gathering. The senior weaver of the family, often a grandmother or great-grandmother whose hands held generations of skill, would take on the role of a biographer. She would visit the elder if they were still able to communicate and sit with them for long, unhurried hours. This wasn't an interview with a checklist of questions. It was a shared space of reminiscing, of quiet listening, of letting the stories unfold naturally. The weaver's presence was one of deep listening, not of pity, holding a hand and absorbing the essence of a life lived. But the story didn't end there. To capture the full picture, the weaver would then become a gentle investigator of the heart. She would seek out the other characters in the elder's life story. She'd speak with their childhood friends, remembering youthful adventures and secrets. She'd sit with their spouse, hearing tales of love, partnership, and shared struggles. She would listen to their children, understanding the legacy they created. She would even seek out old rivals, because conflict and resolution are also part of a complete life. The purpose of this extensive gathering was not to create a flattering, idealized legend. It was to weave an honest tapestry. The Wolof understood that a life is not a single, perfect color. It's a complex interplay of light and shadow. The weaver collected everything, moments of incredible courage and instances of human cowardice, acts of great generosity and small, endearing sacrifices, public triumphs celebrated by the community, and quiet private dreams held only in the heart. The cloth, just like the life it was meant to represent, had to contain both its brilliant threads and its darker, more complex knots. This gathering of stories could take weeks, a slow and deliberate immersion into another person's journey. Once the weaver felt she had gathered enough, she would retreat, not to a desk with pen and paper, but into a space of quiet contemplation. She would not write notes or create outlines. She would hold all these stories, these moments, these emotions within her heart. She would let them settle, feeling for their shapes, their textures, their rhythms. This is where the true artistry began, the translation from memory to symbol. A dangerous journey across the desert in one's youth might feel like a jagged, determined line, sharp and angular. The overwhelming joy of a first child's birth might feel like a sudden, radiant burst of color, a sunburst pattern at the center of the cloth. A long-held grudge that was finally forgiven and released might be represented as a tangled knot that is patiently, carefully untangled and then rewoven into a straight, peaceful thread. The weaver was a master translator, converting an emotional and event-based narrative into a lexicon of textile symbols, a secret language known only to the most experienced master weavers. Each pattern was a word, each color a feeling, each section a chapter. Once the weaver held the entire symbolic map of the life in her mind, the physical preparation of the loom would begin. This wasn't just a mechanical setup, it was a ceremony in itself. The warp threads, the very foundation of the cloth, were often spun from the finest, whitest cotton available. This pure white symbolized a clean slate, the raw, unwritten potential from which this specific, unique life was woven. It represented the soul's pure state before its journey on earth began, and to which it would return. Before the first thread was passed through the warp, a prayer was spoken over the loom. The weaver would ask for clarity of vision, to see the life truly and honestly. She would ask for the skill and grace in her hands to represent it faithfully, to do justice to the person's story without embellishment or omission. This was a moment of consecration, dedicating the loom, the thread, and her own energy to this sacred task. And then the weaving would commence. This work was done in a state of near silence. It was a stark contrast to the usual lively, collaborative hum of the four-generation loom, where stories and songs would be shared among weavers of all ages. Weaving a funeral shroud was a solitary communion. It was a deep, meditative conversation between the weaver biographer and the soul of the subject. Each pass of the shuttle, each press of the beater, was a deliberate act of remembrance. The slow, rhythmic sound of the loom was the only percussion, a heartbeat counting out the moments of a life being reborn in cloth. The weaver wasn't just making an object, she was accompanying a soul on its journey, ensuring that its story, in all its truth and complexity, would be preserved for generations to come. As the cloth grew on the loom, the life story took physical form. You could see the straight, simple weaves of a peaceful childhood, perhaps followed by the complex, interlocking patterns of marriage and family life. A section of dark, dense threads might represent a period of great loss or hardship. A sudden shift to bright, vibrant colors could signify a moment of great joy or a spiritual awakening. The weaver poured all the collected stories, all the felt emotions, into her work. Her hands moved with a knowledge that was deeper than conscious thought, guided by intuition and a profound connection to the person she was honoring. This process was physically and emotionally demanding. The weaver would work for hours on end, her focus absolute. The silence in the weaving hut was not empty. It was filled with the presence of the stories, the weight of a life. It was a sacred space where the past was being actively remembered, literally put back together, member by member, thread by thread. The community understood the gravity of this work. The weaver would be left undisturbed, provided with food and drink, but otherwise allowed to remain in her state of deep concentration. Finally, after weeks or even months of dedicated labor, the last thread would be woven. The cloth would be cut from the loom, another moment of quiet ceremony. The embabudik was complete. It was more than just a shroud. It was a biography, a map of a soul's journey, a final love letter from the living to the one who had passed. When the time came, the elder would be wrapped in their own story, enveloped in a textile that spoke of their joys, their sorrows, their triumphs, and their struggles. At the funeral, the cloth itself would be a focal point. Those who knew the elder well could look at the patterns and recognize the stories. They might point to a section and say, "I remember that. That was the year of the great drought." Or look, here is the pattern for her first grandchild. The shroud became a tool for collective remembrance, prompting the sharing of stories and ensuring that the person's life continued to resonate within the community. It wasn't about mourning what was lost, but celebrating what had been. In this beautiful Wolof tradition, weaving was not just a craft. It was a form of history-keeping, of therapy, of spiritual practice. The embabudik teaches us a powerful lesson about memory and honor. It shows us that a life, in its entirety, is a thing of beauty, worthy of being captured and preserved. It reminds us that even in death, our stories do not end. They are simply translated into a new language, a language of thread and pattern, to be read, touched, and remembered by those we leave behind. It's a testament to the idea that the most enduring monument we can build to a person is the honest and loving telling of their story. Imagine a language, not of words, but of threads. A story not written in ink, but woven into cloth. Today, we're going to explore a tradition so profound, it turns the final act of life into a breathtaking work of art. We're talking about a special kind of funeral cloth, where every pattern, every color, every single thread tells the intricate story of a person's existence. This wasn't a simple code, like a one-to-one cipher. It was a poetic system, nuanced and deeply personal. The foundation of the cloth, the long vertical threads known as the warp, often represented the person's core being. Think of it as their spiritual DNA, their lineage, their unwavering principles, the very structure of their character. Everything that happened to them, the events of their life, was then woven horizontally across this foundation as the weft. This created a rich tapestry, a textile biography. Let's look at how specific life events were translated into this silent language. A period of great success, like a bountiful harvest or a thriving business, wasn't just a simple mark. It might be represented by a dense, beautiful cluster of interconnected triangles. These shapes symbolized abundance and stable foundations, a pyramid of prosperity built upon hard work. It was a visual celebration of a good year, a good season of life. But life, as we know, is not all success. What about times of hardship? A period of grief or famine would be depicted very differently. The weaver might create a section with thin, broken lines, or even leave a deliberately sparse area where the weft was widely spaced. This created a tangible sense of emptiness in the fabric, a visual void that mirrored the emotional or physical lack experienced during that time. You could literally see and feel the leanness of those years. And what about our human flaws, our mistakes? This tradition had a beautiful way of acknowledging them without condemnation. A great mistake, followed by a period of atonement, could be shown as a bold, discordant pattern. Imagine a jarring, geometric shape that breaks the harmony of the surrounding design. But it wouldn't end there. Slowly, over several inches of cloth, that disruptive pattern would be repaired. The weaver would introduce careful, bridging patterns, gradually integrating the mistake back into the main design. It's a powerful metaphor. Our errors don't have to define us. They can be mended, learned from, and woven back into the larger story of who we become. It's a story of redemption told in thread. Unfulfilled dreams or lost loves were also given a place in the narrative. These might be represented by a pattern that begins strongly, full of promise, but then fades out before reaching the edge of the cloth. Another way was to use a single, beautiful thread of an unusual color, one that traveled alone through a section before disappearing entirely. It's a poignant, subtle nod to the what-ifs and the quiet sorrows that everyone carries. The paths not taken, the stories left unfinished. The most intimate details, the small, quiet moments that truly define a life, were encoded in the tiniest of patterns. You'd often find them along the very edges of the cloth or hidden in the seams. Like secrets whispered between the weaver and the deceased, the gentle touch of a beloved's hand. A cherished memory might be a tiny, repeated motif of interlocking circles, symbolizing an unbreakable bond, a secret act of kindness. Something done for a stranger with no expectation of reward could be a small, almost invisible symbol of an open palm, hidden within a larger border. The weaver worked with the devotion of a scribe illuminating a holy book. They understood that every element, whether seen by all or hidden from view, was essential to the truth of the whole. Nothing was insignificant. Every choice had meaning. And the colors carried the emotional weight of the story. The weaver, who often knew the person intimately, would select the threads herself. The vibrant indigos and rich ochres of a dynamic Middle Age might slowly give way to the more muted, sophisticated grays and deep, earthy browns of the later years. This color palette created a visual timeline, a gradient of life's energy. A life marked by extensive travel might incorporate unexpected colors from other regions, a bright thread of Saharan yellow, a surprising hint of coastal blue, turning the cloth into a topographic map of a soulless journey across the world. Let's just pause for a moment here. Can you picture it? The solitary weaver, working late into the night, the only sounds being the gentle crackle of a fire and a rhythmic click-clack of the loom. Can you feel the immense responsibility resting on her shoulders? She held an entire human life in her mind, in her hands. She made the profound decisions about how to translate joy, sorrow, failure, and love into the silent, permanent language of thread. She was weaving not just a shroud, but a testament. A final judgment, not of condemnation, but of witness. A final, beautiful gift to the person and their community. This intricate process wasn't rushed. It could take many, many months. Often, the weaving would outlast the person whose life it chronicled. If the elder passed away before the cloth was finished, the work continued, now infused with an even deeper poignancy and reverence. The weaver was no longer just recording a life. She was completing it. The final stitches were often the most symbolic of all. The weaver might close the cloth with a pattern of completed circles, signifying a life returned to its source, the cycle complete. Or she might choose a border of flourishing, plant-like patterns representing the legacy the person left behind the children, students, and ideas that would continue to grow and thrive in the world long after they were gone. And then, the moment of completion, when the cloth was finally cut from the loom, it was so much more than a piece of fabric. It was a closed book, a completed story, its narrative sealed within the warp and weft. It was ready for its final reading, not with the eyes alone, but with the heart and the memory of the community. It was a final, irrefutable statement. This person lived. This was their story. And it was beautiful. Imagine a funeral unlike any you've ever known. It's not just a farewell. It's a profound public reading, a storytelling event that brings an entire community together. This was the reality in many Wolof communities, centered around an extraordinary tradition, the reading of the cloth. The funeral ceremony was a two-part affair. The first part was the burial of the body, a somber and necessary act. But the second part was where the true magic happened, where the community's heart beat as one. This was the reading of the funeral cloth. Before the deceased was laid to rest, this magnificent hand-woven textile was unfolded and presented in a place of honor. It might be stretched taut on a wooden frame or held high by family members, its intricate patterns catching the light, a silent testament waiting to be given a voice. The entire village would gather in the square, their faces a mixture of grief and anticipation. A designated reader, often a griata respected praesinger, an oral historian with an encyclopedic knowledge of the weaving symbols, would step forward. His presence commanded attention. He stood before the cloth not just as a eulogist, but as a translator, a bridge between the silent threads and the living souls who watched. This wasn't a eulogy in the way we might think of one today, a string of kind words and fond memories. This was something deeper, a raw and honest recitation of a life lived. The griot's voice would ring out across the silent crowd as he pointed to a specific section of the cloth. See here, he might begin, his finger tracing a series of jagged, sharp lines. These lines, like the teeth of the savannah wind that bites at your skin. This tells of the year of the great drought. This tells of when our brother, our departed friend, walked for 10 days to the distant river. He didn't do this for his own family, but to bring back water for the children of a man who was his enemy. With his own thirst, he mended a blood feud that had poisoned our village for generations. The griot's hand would then move across the tapestry of threads. And look here, he would say, pointing to a vibrant burst of red woven amidst a field of cool blue. This red is the fire of his temper, a temper that once burned a friendship to the ground. But notice how this fire is contained. It's held within a border of grey, the color of ash and deep regret. The cloth doesn't hide his flaws. It shows them, and from that ash, see how a new pattern emerges. Look at these careful, straight lines. This is the patience he learned from his mistake. This is the friendship he rebuilt, stronger than before, founded on the ruins of the old one. The reading was incredibly detailed, unflinching in its honesty, yet celebratory. It acknowledged the full, complex humanity of the person who had passed. It didn't gloss over the difficult parts or the mistakes. It presented the whole person, flaws and all, because that is what it means to be human. Children in the crowd would hear stories of their elders' foolish youth, learning that even the most respected figures were once young and made mistakes. The community would be reminded of collective hardships, like famines or conflicts, but they would see these events through the lens of one individual's endurance, one person's journey through that shared history. Mistakes were named not to shame the memory of the deceased, but to teach the living. The cloth provided the undeniable evidence, the woven proof of the life's events. The The griot provided the narrative, the context, the meaning. He gave voice to the threads, turning a textile into a living history lesson. By the end of this powerful reading, the person was not truly gone. They were enshrined in the communal memory, their life story literally woven into the cultural fabric of their people. The cloth, having shared its story with the living, then performed its final, sacred function. It was carefully folded to wrap the body of the deceased. The person returned to the earth, literally embraced by their own story, cloaked in the narrative of their life. Let's just pause on that for a moment. Think about the incredible power of that public accounting. A life reviewed not in whispers or in secret, but out in the open air, under the sky, for everyone to see and hear. Its meaning was extracted and gifted to the living. It was the ultimate form of accountability and, at the same time, the ultimate honor. There was no hiding, only a celebration of a complete, authentic life. After the burial, the story continued. The cloth wasn't simply discarded. Pieces of it might be carefully cut and distributed among the closest family members. A widow might receive a strip to tie in her hair, a constant, tangible reminder of her husband's life and love. A son might be given a small square to keep inside his amulet, a protective charm carrying the strength and wisdom of his father's story. In this way, the cloth continued to live, to protect, and to teach. Long after the funeral was over, the loom, in this culture, was not just a tool for making fabric. It was a device for creating the most profound of all books. It crafted a biography that was also a winding sheet. It produced a lesson that was also a companion for the soul's journey into the ancestral realm. This deep, integrated world of woven meaning, where every thread told a story and every pattern held a history, was a testament to a way of life where art, memory, and community were inseparable. This rich and meaningful world was what would soon be threatened. The threat didn't come from a change of heart or a loss of faith within the community. It came from the outside, an invasion of cheap, mass-produced, and silent cloth from across the sea. This new fabric was functional, yes, but it had no story to tell. Its threads were mute. Its patterns were meaningless decoration. It couldn't speak of drought or forgiveness, of temper or patience. It couldn't hold the history of a person or a people. The arrival of this foreign cloth began a slow erosion of this powerful tradition. Why spend months weaving a story when a simple, cheap alternative was available? The economic pressure was immense. The old ways, so rich in meaning, began to feel like a luxury, then a burden, and then, for many, a forgotten memory. The looms fell silent, and with them, the storytellers, the public reading of the cloth, that powerful act of communal remembering, began to fade. Funerals became quieter, more private affairs. The vibrant, honest biographies, woven in thread, were replaced by silent, anonymous shrouds. The loss was immeasurable. It wasn't just the loss of an art form, but the loss of a language, a way of understanding life, death, and community. When the cloths lost their voice, a part of the collective memory was erased. The lessons held within the threads, the stories of resilience and redemption, were no longer passed down with the same visceral power. The community lost a vital tool for teaching its children and for reinforcing its values. This story isn't just a nostalgic look at a lost tradition. It's a powerful reminder of what we lose when we prioritize convenience and cost over meaning and connection. In our modern world, we are surrounded by mass-produced objects that are devoid of story. Our clothes, our furniture, our tools, they are efficient, but they are silent. We've gained a world of convenience, but we've lost a world of meaning. The story of the funeral cloth asks us a question. How do we tell our stories today? How do we remember our dead? How do we teach our children about the complexities of a life well lived? We write eulogies, We share photos on social media. We tell stories at wakes. These are our modern rituals. But is there something missing? Is there a depth of honesty, of communal accounting, that we've lost? The Wolof tradition of the reading of the cloth teaches us that a life's true value is found in its entirety, the successes and the failures, the joys and the regrets. It teaches us that our stories are not just for ourselves, but for our community. They are lessons, warnings, and inspirations. And perhaps, most importantly, it shows us that the most beautiful way to honor a person is to tell their story truthfully, openly, and with love. The loom may be gone, but the lesson of the cloth remains, woven into history itself. The story of colonialism is often told with cannons and flags, with armies and declarations. But sometimes the invasion begins much more quietly, not with a gunshot, but with the rustle of cloth. In the coastal markets of St. Louis and Dakar, a new commodity began to appear. It was bright, it was uniform, and it was impossibly cheap. French manufactured textiles, printed with endless, repetitive florals and geometric shapes, arrived on the shores of Senegal. The traders who brought them, with a mix of commercial zeal and colonial paternalism, called them le tissu de la civilisation, the cloth of civilization. But to the Wolof weavers, the guardians of a centuries-old tradition, this was something else entirely. They saw it as cloth of a terrifying silence. It had no story, its patterns were empty, born from the cold, unthinking logic of a machine, not from the deep well of a proverb's wisdom. Its colors were chemical, harsh, and destined to fade into a sickly, washed-out pallor, a ghost of their initial brightness. It was a stark contrast to the noble, dignified aging of indigo, which deepened and grew more complex with time, just like the stories it told. The French cloth shouted its presence, but it had absolutely nothing to say. Imagine standing in that bustling market. The air is thick with the scent of spices, fish, and the dry earth. In one corner, a French trader theatrically unrolls a bolt of this new, garish tartan fabric. A crowd of Wolof women gathers, a mixture of curiosity and deep-seated apprehension in their eyes. They touch the cloth. It feels slick, impersonal. A few stalls away, in a quieter, more shaded spot, you see the traditional woven cloths. The rich, deep blues of indigo, the earthy tones of hand-spun cotton, the intricate patterns that aren't just decoration but a language, a history book, a family tree woven into thread. The contrast is jarring. It's the difference between a factory and a home, between noise and a conversation. At first, this cloth of civilization was just a novelty, a curious import. But the gears of the colonial machine were turning. A novelty soon gave way to a harsh economic necessity. The French administration, through a carefully constructed system of taxation and control over trade routes, began to squeeze the life out of the local weaving economy. It became increasingly difficult, and then nearly impossible, for local weavers to source good quality cotton or to sell their own meticulously crafted work at a price that could sustain them. Think about the brutal math of it. A hand-woven pagni, a traditional wraparound garment which might take a master weaver a month to create, imbued with skill, spirit, and story, now had to compete in the market with a French factory-printed version that was churned out in mere minutes. The economic foundation of the weaving families, a foundation that was also the very bedrock of their cultural memory, began to crack under the strain. The rhythmic, life-affirming sound of the loomner clack-clack-clack that had been the heartbeat of village life for centuries. The score to which daily life was lived began to stutter. Then, in more and more homes, it faded into silence. The magnificent looms, which were not just tools but members of the family, shrines to ancestral knowledge, began to stand silent in their shelters, gathering dust and shadows. Grandmothers, their hands still holding the muscle memory of 1,000 patterns, watched with a quiet, breaking heart as their own. Daughters, pressured by the urgent, undeniable need to feed their families, began to buy the cheap, silent cloth from the market. Instead of weaving their own, this was so much more than just an economic shift. It was a philosophical assault. The French administrators, in their self-proclaimed role as bringers of progress, saw traditional weaving as a primitive craft. To them, it was a charming but ultimately inefficient piece of folk art, something to be documented in a museum perhaps, but inevitably supplanted by the efficiency of modern, industrial production. They saw a simple product and offered a cheaper alternative. What they failed to understand, or, more likely, what they chose not to understand, was that they weren't just replacing a product, they were severing a neural pathway of an entire society. They were replacing a library with a single poster. They were replacing a conversation that spanned generations with a sterile, one-sided monologue. They were replacing a living, breathing archive with dead, soulless inventory. The loom was the center of education. It was where knowledge was transmitted from great-grandmother to grandchild. It was where stories were told, where proverbs were explained, where the symbolic language of the patterns was passed down. Not through textbooks, but through touch, through rhythm, through shared work and shared breath. With the looms silent, that transmission was broken. A new generation began to grow up knowing only the feel of slick, printed, foreign cloth. They were being denied their own textured language, the language of woven proverbs that had defined their identity for time immemorial. Let's just pause here for a moment. Close your eyes and listen. Not to my voice, but to the silence I'm describing. Can you hear it? The sound of that emptiness in the weaver's sheds. It's not a peaceful quiet, it's a void, an absence. It asks the feeling of a word on the tip of your tongue that you can quite remember. It's the ache of a language on the verge of being forgotten, of a library with its doors locked and the key thrown away. Imagine the weight of that silence, the cultural loss it represents, a whole world of meaning, of connection, of identity, just fading away. The young mother, herself now dressed in the cheap printed fabric, walks past the silent giant of the family loom with a basket of groceries, not even giving it a glance. It's no longer a part of her world. It's just an artifact from a past that feels increasingly distant. For the weavers themselves, the guardians of this sacred knowledge, this was a crisis of devastating proportions. Their art, their purpose, their spiritual role in the community was being rendered obsolete, irrelevant, by a tidal wave of cheap cotton. Some tried to adapt. They began weaving simpler, faster goods aimed at the nascent tourist trades, small strips of cloth with basic, generic patterns, stripped of their deep, contextual meaning. It was a way to survive, but it was a shadow of their true art. It was like asking a great poet to write advertising jingles. But for the master weavers, the ones who still held the full, complex lexicon of symbols and stories in their hearts and in their fingers, this was a spiritual death. They watched as their entire world, their visual and tactile landscape, was being wrapped in this foreign, mute fabric. They felt their culture being erased, their wisdom being devalued. They knew they had to respond, but they had no weapons in the conventional sense. They had no political power, no army to command. All they had was the loom. All they had was the thread. And all they had was the secret language that lived in their hands and in their collective memory. It was all they had, and they decided it would have to be enough. And so, in the face of this overwhelming cultural and economic assault, they decided to fight back with the only tools they possessed. They would weave their resistance. They would turn their looms back into voices. They would make the silent threads speak again, louder and more defiantly than ever before. Their response wouldn't be a riot in the streets, but a revolution on the loom. A quiet, intricate, and profoundly powerful act of defiance, woven one thread at a time. In the dead of night, a secret council was called. Under the guise of a funeral or a naming ceremony, the eldest master weavers from several villages gathered. Their faces, etched with the wisdom of generations, were grave in the flickering lamplight. How could they preserve their ancestral knowledge? How could they possibly protest this silent, creeping invasion that threatened to erase their very identity? Then one woman, an elder whose hands were now too stiff to hold the shuttle, but whose mind was a living archive of every pattern and story, proposed a plan of breathtaking subtlety. Her voice, like the rustle of dry leaves, filled the small courtyard. "They see our patterns as mere decoration," she whispered. "They are blind to the meaning woven within. So, let us give them new meanings. Meanings they will never see, but our children and their children's children will remember forever." And so began an act of coded subversion, a rebellion fought not with weapons, but with thread and loom. They would continue to weave the traditional forms, the beautiful strips of cloth, the paglins, the ceremonial shawls for their own people, for the rituals that held their communities together. But into these same patterns, they would weave new, secret symbols, symbols of protest, of memory, of a truth the colonizers tried to bury. The colonial administrators, so proud of the authentic native art they were collecting, would hang these textiles in their grand homes and sterile offices, completely unaware that they were displaying banners of sedition on their very own walls. A new, covert lexicon was born, a pattern that looked like interlocking chains. A common symbol of unity was subtly altered. To the Wolof, it was no longer unity. It was the chilling representation of colonial shackles, a series of arrows pointing downwards, cleverly disguised within an intricate border. Wasn't just a design element. It was a lament for falling crop prices, a cry against exploitation, a symbol of a people brought low by foreign rule. What appeared to be a beautiful, complex flower at the center of a cloth might, upon the closest inspection by someone who knew what to look for, reveal itself as a map of a village that had been forcibly dismantled and erased from the official colonial charts. The genius of the plan was its invisibility. The subversion had to be utterly undetectable to the untrained foreign eye, yet as clear as day to a Wolof person who knew how to truly see. The act of weaving became an exercise in immense courage and profound focus. On the surface, the weaver was a picture of calm, traditional craftsmanship, her movements rhythmic and serene. But beneath that placid exterior, her mind and hands were plotting rebellion with every pass of the shuttle. The great-grandmothers, the revered elders who had devised the plan, now served as strategists. They would whisper the new, secret symbols to the grandmothers. The grandmothers, in turn, would translate these abstract concepts into specific colors and thread placements, guiding the mothers who sat at the looms. And the children, the youngest generation, passing the shuttle back and forth, were learning more than just a craft. They were absorbing a new, dangerous vocabulary, a language of resistance spoken in silence. The 4-generation loom, once a tool for teaching proverbs and history, had been repurposed. It was now a clandestine printing press, turning out broadsheets of defiance disguised as art. These textiles became silent messengers, carrying news and solidarity across the colonized land. A weaver in one village might hear of a brutal land confiscation in a distant region. In response, she would meticulously weave the hidden map of that stolen land into a new cloth. When that cloth traveled, through trade or as a gift to a relative, it carried the news with it, a silent broadcast of injustice. Imagine a bustling market square, a woman wearing a shawl with the secret chain break, pattern woven into its hem might catch a glimpse of the same pattern on another woman's garment across the crowded space. No words were needed. A simple, shared glance was enough. It was a silent signal of shared resistance, a powerful moment of recognition between allies in a war fought in the quiet spaces, in the threads that bound them together. The irony was as rich and complex as the patterns themselves. The very objects the colonizers prized as trophies of their cultural dominance were, in fact, testaments to their blindness. They would point to a cloth and speak of its primitive beauty or its charming folk aesthetic, all while standing before a declaration of defiance. The weavers, with their profound understanding of symbolism and their deep connection to their heritage, had turned the colonizer's gaze back on itself. They had transformed an object of appropriation into a tool of agency. Every thread was a choice, every color a statement. The deep indigo might represent the sorrow of their people, while a sudden flash of vibrant red could signify a hidden spark of hope and defiance. This wasn't just about protest. It was about survival. It was about ensuring that the true history, the real stories, and the soul of the Wolof people would not be bleached out by colonial rule. While the official records were written by the occupiers, the weavers were creating their own archive, one that was durable, portable, and indecipherable to their oppressors. These cloths became history books, filled with stories that could be read, worn, and passed down through the gentle touch of a grandmother's hand. They ensured that the next generation would not only know the patterns of their ancestors, but would also understand the courage woven into every single inch. It was a legacy of resilience, a masterclass in resistance, proving that even in the face of overwhelming power, the human spirit, armed with creativity and courage, can find a way to speak its truth. Have you ever looked at a beautiful piece of art and wondered what secrets it might hold? What if I told you that some of the most stunning textiles in the world contain hidden messages of defiance, woven right under the noses of their oppressors? Today, we re-unraveling the incredible story of the Wolof weavers of Senegal and how they turned their looms into weapons of silent resistance. This isn't just about beautiful patterns. It's about a secret language of thread, a story of courage, and a powerful legacy that continues to inspire. During the French colonial period in West Africa, local cultures were often suppressed or exoticized. The French saw themselves as patrons of so-called native arts, but what they failed to understand was the deep, complex language embedded within these traditions. The art of weaving, for the Wolof people, was more than just a craft. It was a library, a historical record, and a form of communication passed down through generations. Every color, every pattern, and every knot had a specific meaning, telling stories of lineage, proverbs, and community values. A certain combination of colors could signify a marriage, while a particular geometric shape might represent a philosophical concept about life and the universe. This was a rich, visual language, understood by everyone within the community. But when colonial rule threatened to erase their culture, the weavers didn't abandon their craft. They adapted. They took this language underground, transforming it into a subtle, powerful tool of protest. One of the most famous surviving examples of this coded resistance is a piece known today as the Governor's Pillow. The story goes that a French governor in Dakar, immensely proud of his appreciation for local craftsmanship, commissioned a set of pillow covers from a renowned master weaver named Nandi. He wanted something that would showcase the traditional art of the region, something to impress his guests and display his sophisticated taste. Nandi, a respected elder in her community, accepted the commission with a polite, bowed head. What she delivered was breathtaking. The pillow covers featured bold zigzags and diamond patterns in rich indigo and brilliant whiter. Stunning example of classic Wolof geometry. The governor was absolutely delighted. He saw exactly what he wanted to see. Exotic, primitive beauty. He proudly placed the pillows in his opulent salon, a centerpiece for all his colonial associates to admire. He would gesture to them, explaining the supposed symbolism of the traditional designs, completely oblivious to the real message he was displaying. What the governor couldn't see, but what Nandi's family and her entire community knew, was the secret declaration of defiance woven into every thread. To the untrained eye, the zigzag pattern was just that, a decorative element. But in the Wolof visual language, a zigzag traditionally represents a difficult path, a journey filled with obstacles. Nandi, however, made a crucial, subtle alteration. At the very peak of each zigzag, she wove a tiny, almost imperceptible, straight black line. To her people, this addition was unmistakable. It was a spear point. The pattern no longer just said a difficult path. It now read, the path of the conqueror is lined with spears. It was a threat, a warning, hidden in plain sight. But she didn't stop there. In the border of the pillow, she wove a repeating diamond motif. Diamonds in Wolof weaving often symbolize promises or agreements. But here, Nandi introduced a deliberate flaw. Every third diamond was incomplete. It had a missing corner. A broken diamond symbolized a broken promise. The border, therefore, whispered a constant, damning accusation. Their promises are empty. 1 in 3 is a lie. The governor, lounging against his pillow, was literally resting his head on a declaration of his own treachery and the danger he was in. This wasn't an isolated incident. This practice of subversive weaving became a quiet, widespread form of protest. Let's look at another example. A wealthy French merchant commissioned a large, magnificent wall hanging for his home. The design he received depicted a majestic baobab tree, a powerful and common symbol in West African culture representing strength, community, and longevity. The merchant was thrilled. He hung it in his main hall, believing it represented the exotic, timeless strength of Africa, perfect piece of decor to show off his connection to the continent. He saw a tree. The weavers saw a memorial. If you were to look closely, you would notice that the roots of the tree were woven in a slightly darker shade of brown, drawing subtle attention to them. And if you were to count those roots, you would find there were exactly 19. Why 19? Because that year, 19 villages in the Weavers region had lost their communal lands to a single, sweeping colonial land grant. That land had been the lifeblood of those communities for generations. The baobab in the tapestry stood strong, a symbol of enduring spirit, but its roots, the hidden count, told a story of devastating theft and loss. For the French merchant, it was a piece of art. For the weavers and their community, it was a public secret, a monument to their stolen heritage displayed in the home of one of the colonizers. Let's just pause here for a moment and appreciate the delicious, dangerous irony of this. The colonizer, sitting in his salon or walking through his home, believes he is showcasing his power, his dominance, and his sophisticated appreciation of a primitive culture. He thinks the art on his walls and the pillows on his sofa are trophies of his conquest. But in reality, he is showcasing a meticulous, courageous, and damning indictment of his own rule. The cloth, so silent, so beautiful, holds a scream woven in code. It's an act of incredible bravery. These weavers, particularly women like Nandi, were putting themselves at enormous risk. If their codes were ever deciphered by the authorities, the punishment would have been severe. Yet they continued. They used the very tools of their culture to fight for its survival, turning a symbol of colonial patronage into a banner of resistance. This period of clandestine weaving is a powerful testament to the resilience of knowledge systems. When this visual language was driven underground, it didn't die. It adapted. It became sly. It became clever. It became a weapon for those who had no other. The loom, which had always been an instrument of cultural continuity, of passing down stories and wisdom from one generation to the next, now became an instrument of quiet, defiant rebellion. The patterns that were once open books of communal knowledge became encrypted messages of survival and protest. It's a profound concept. The very same threads held two completely different stories. One was a story of beauty and tradition for the colonizer to consume. The other was a story of pain, of resistance, and of hope for the community. The cloth held the memory of the world that was being destroyed, and at the same time it held the protest against the destroyers. It was a time capsule of defiance, waiting patiently, as patient as the loom itself, for a future time when the code would be broken not by enemies, but by the heirs of this incredible legacy. And that's exactly what happened. Generations later, as scholars, historians, and the descendants of these weavers began to revisit these textiles, the codes started to be deciphered. Grandmothers passed on the oral histories that accompanied the weavings. Researchers compared patterns with historical events. The secrets, so carefully guarded, began to emerge. What was once dismissed as simple ethnic design was revealed to be a complex, political, and deeply moving form of historical documentation. These textiles are now understood not just as beautiful objects, but as historical documents, as acts of political speech from people who were denied a voice. This story forces us to look at art, history, and culture in a new light. It reminds us that resistance doesn't always involve shouting or open conflict. Sometimes, the most powerful acts of defiance are the quietest. They are hidden in the crafts we practice, the songs we sing, and the stories we tell. The Wolof weavers teach us that culture is not a fragile thing that shatters under pressure. It is resilient, adaptive, and endlessly creative. It can bend without breaking, and in the hands of courageous people, it can become a source of immense strength and a tool for justice. So the next time you see a piece of traditional art, whether it's a tapestry, a piece of pottery, or a carving, take a closer look. Ask yourself what stories it might be telling. What secrets might be hidden within its patterns, its colors, and its forms. You might just discover a hidden language, a secret history, a silent scream woven in thread. A century had turned. Senegal was independent, a nation finding its own rhythm after the long, slow dance of colonial rule. The cheap French cloth, once a symbol of dominance, was still everywhere, but its political weight had faded. It was just fabric now, its story largely forgotten by a generation born into freedom. In a bright, sun-drenched atelier in Dhaka, a young fashion designer named Katie Diop was wrestling with this very idea. She felt a deep, gnawing dissatisfaction. She wanted her designs to be more than just stylish. She wanted them to be profoundly Senegalese, not just in their look, but in their very soul. She pushed aside the bolts of generic African print fabric, the kind mass-produced in Europe and shipped back to the continent. They felt hollow, disconnected from the land she loved. Searching for a truer inspiration, a more authentic voice, she went to her grandmother's old, brass-bound trunk. It was a repository of family history, filled with the scent of camphor and thyme. She carefully unfolded the old, hand-woven pieces, feeling the weight of generations in her hands. Among them, she pulled out a pagni, a traditional wrap skirt that had belonged to her great-grandmother. It was breathtaking. Complex geometric patterns danced in faded shades of indigo and ivory. The cloth was soft, worn with love and life. As she spread it across her large cutting table, sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the intricate threads. Something caught her eye. Along one edge, tucked into a band of pattern she'd always assumed was purely decorative. She saw a tiny, repeated anomaly. It was a subtle variation in the weave, almost invisible to the naked eye. Her curiosity piqued. She grabbed a magnifying glass and leaned in closer. Her heart began to beat a little faster. It looked like writing. Not the Roman letters she knew, but tiny, stylized loops and lines. They were strangely familiar, resembling the curves of Wolof, Ajami script. The Arabic-based alphabet used to write her native language. Was it possible? Could someone actually weave writing into cloth, hiding words within a pattern? The thought was electrifying. The very fabric she held could be telling a story she had never known how to read. Driven by this incredible possibility, she carefully wrapped the precious cloth and took it to the University of Dakar. She found a historian, a woman who had dedicated her life to the study of West African textiles. Together, they placed the pagni under a high-powered digital microscope. As the image appeared on the screen, magnified 1,000 times, Katie gasped. The truth was undeniable. Woven thread by meticulous thread. It wasn't just writing. It was a full sentence. Nanu emi, nan sheng wei, nanu fataliku. The historian translated the Wolof phrase. Her voice filled with awe. They may not know, but we will remember. Katie felt a shock run through her. A connection to the past so powerful it was almost physical. She was holding a protest cloth from the colonial era. Her own great-grandmother had been part of a silent resistance. This wasn't just a pattern. It was a message, a secret whispered into the loom, a defiant cry that had now found its voice across a century. This discovery changed everything for Katie. The beautiful old fabrics in trunks and museums weren't just art anymore. They were archives. They were pages from a hidden history, written in thread by the people who lived it. Her mission shifted. She was no longer just a fashion designer. She was a detective of memory, an archaeologist of textiles. She began a quest, traveling through Senegal to collect old woven pieces. She visited families in dusty villages who brought out heirlooms wrapped in plastic. She negotiated with museums to study their collections. She assembled a team as unconventional as her mission, linguists to help with the Ajami script, historians to provide context, and, most importantly, the few remaining very old weavers. These were women in their 80s and 90s, who were children during the colonial period. They held vague, dreamlike memories of their mothers and grandmothers doing the special weaving. They set up what they called a laboratory of memory in Katie's studio. The process was a blend of old-world wisdom and modern technology. They would lay an ancient textile on a large table, photograph it in ultra-high resolution, and then pore over the digital images on their laptops, zooming in on every single thread. The old weavers, their eyesight now failing, would close their eyes and run their fingertips over the originals. Their sense of touch was their microscope. They could feel the subtle, raised patterns of the hidden symbols, the bumps and ridges that formed the secret language. One afternoon, an elderly woman named Yasini paused, her trembling finger resting on a seemingly random cluster of stitches on a faded shawl. "Here," she whispered, her voice raspy with age. "This is not a mistake. This is the eye that sees but says nothing." The team leaned in, captivated. It was a symbol, she explained, woven for the informants, those who had to work for the French but secretly passed information to our leaders. This shawl told people who they could trust. It was a revelation. Each textile was a key, unlocking a new room in the house of their history. Piece by piece, story by story, they began to decode the secret language of resistance. The patterns revealed so much more than anyone had ever imagined. They found woven maps detailing escape routes through the bush, They uncovered lists of names of community members who had been arrested. They found records of unjust taxes imposed by the colonial administration, and even tributes to resistance leaders who had been killed. Their stories woven into cloth to ensure they would never be truly erased. This was a parallel history, a tactile narrative of the colonial period, documented by the people who endured it, hidden in plain sight from the rulers who caused their suffering. The cloth spoke of resilience, of quiet defiance, of a culture that refused to be silenced. Katie finally understood her true calling. Her generation's task was not just to preserve these textiles in glass cases. Their duty was to read them, to listen to them, and to let their powerful stories speak once more. She would take these rediscovered words, these threads of history, and weave them into the future, creating a new kind of fashion, one that was not just worn, but remembered. The work was a monumental task, like trying to decipher a forgotten language, a secret code hidden in plain sight. Our team had to meticulously cross-reference every thread, every color, every pattern. It was a painstaking process of connecting the dots. We defined a specific design on a cloth from St. Louis and see it echoed on another piece from Thies. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a conversation, a coordinated message sent across distances. We were searching for those new, covert symbols that the elder weavers had told us about. The modified chains, the intentionally broken diamonds, the zigzags that ended in sharp spear points. Slowly, a dual reality emerged from the textiles. We began to see two distinct layers in every piece from that colonial era. There was the surface layer, the beautiful, decorative patterns designed to please the eye of the colonizer, to be aesthetically pleasing and non-threatening. But beneath that, woven into the very fabric of the cloth, was a subcutaneous layer. This was the layer of truth, of defiance. A secret language meant to preserve history and foster a powerful sense of solidarity among the weavers and their communities. One of our most significant breakthroughs, a true turning point in our research, came from a single, magnificent funeral cloth housed in the National Museum. It was a large, breathtaking piece, and its official attribution was to a weaver from a village that had been completely uprooted and relocated to make way for a colonial plantation. The little card next to it in the display case read, "Funerary Textile, late 19th century. Geometric patterns symbolizing the afterlife." It was a simple, academic description for a piece that held a universe of meaning. When my team carefully laid it out on the large table in the research room, the central pattern immediately drew our eyes. It was a stunning, radiating sun, a symbol of life and power. But something felt off. Following a hunch, we started to count the rays extending from the sun's core. There weren't 12, the traditional number. There were 34. We turned to our consultant, the old weaver who had guided us with her ancestral knowledge. She shook her head slowly, her brow furrowed. "The sun has 12 rays in the old language," she said, her voice firm. "Always. It represents the 12 months of the year, the 12 hours of the day. But 20... She paused, her mind racing through generations of oral history. Then, her eyes widened in a moment of sudden, profound realization. "The village," she whispered, "the village they destroyed. It had 24 families before they were scattered to the winds." That single realization sent a jolt of electricity. Through the room, we weren't just looking at a pattern anymore. We were looking at a map, a census of a lost community. We immediately moved closer, examining the radiating lines with a new sense of urgency. Under magnification, we saw another hidden detail. The lines weren't perfectly straight, as they appeared from a distance. They were composed of micro-zigzags, almost imperceptible to the naked eye. They weren't just rays. They represented a path, a journey, a difficult, winding path. And then we saw it. At the very end of each of the 24 paths, the thread changed color for just 2 tiny stitches. It was a subtle shift to a different shade of brown, a deep, earthy tone. The old weaver recognized it instantly. It was the color of the dry, packed earth of a homestead floor, the foundation of a family home. The cloth was not about the spiritual afterlife at all. It was a memorial, a cartographic testament to a historical tragedy. It mapped the forced diaspora of the 24 families from their central home, which was symbolized by the sun. It traced their winding, agonizing paths into exile. This wasn't a funeral cloth for a single person. It was a funeral cloth for an entire village. A profound, heartbreaking act of historical witness, masterfully disguised as a simple spiritual symbol. Uncovering these truths was emotionally overwhelming. There were days I couldn't face the team. I would often sit alone in the archive, late at night, with one of the decoded pieces spread out before me. I'd gently run my fingers over the threads, feeling the immense weight of the story it carried. In those quiet moments, it felt like I was touching the raw emotions of my ancestors. I could feel the anger, the deep, inconsolable grief, but also the incredible cunning and the defiant, unbreakable hope of my great-grandmother's generation. They had refused to let their story be erased. The cloth, which had once been just a source of artistic inspiration for my own work, was now something more. It was a charge, a sacred responsibility handed down through time. I knew then that I had to make this known. I had to find a way to take this reclaimed history, this hidden language of resilience, and weave it back into the consciousness of modern Senegal, ensuring that the voices encoded in these threads would never be silenced again. This history belongs to all of us, and it's a story that demands to be told. This next collection had to be her statement. Katie decided to call it Le Chuchotement du Métier, the whisper of the loom. For months, she and her team poured their hearts into their work. This wasn't about simply copying old patterns. It was a deep, meaningful dialogue with them. Imagine this, a dress with a sleek, modern silhouette, but the fabric it's made from. It's hand-woven on a traditional loom. And woven into it is a decoded protest pattern, the broken chain motif reimagined as a bold, graphic stripe. Or a man's impeccably tailored jacket, but instead of a silk lining, it's lined with a reproduction of the hidden Wolof script. The words, "We will remember, a secret promise kept close." The collection was a labor of love, a bridge between past and present. Katie worked tirelessly in her studio, surrounded by bolts of incredible fabric and sketches covering every surface. You'd see her carefully pinning a modern dress form. The fabric itself, a stunning fusion, a contemporary cut made from a cloth that featured a bold, graphic reinterpretation of the traditional spear-point zigzag protest pattern. Each pin was placed with intention, each drape and fold considered. This was more than design. It was storytelling. It was giving a voice to the silent threads of history, translating their whispers for a new generation. And then there was the piece de resistance. It was a gown unlike any other, crafted entirely from narrow strips of hand-woven fabric. Each individual strip was woven by a different weaver from a different region of Senegal, and each strip contained its own decoded symbol, its own secret message from the colonial era. When worn, the gown became a living map of resistance, a breathtaking tapestry of whispers stitched together into a single, powerful, unified voice. The accessories were just as meaningful. Katie collaborated with jewelers to create pieces inspired by the tiny, hidden symbols they had discovered. There were elegant earrings shaped like the eye that sees but says nothing, and a stunning cuff bracelet meticulously etched with the microscopic map from the governor's pillow. The location for the runway show was a deliberate, powerful choice. It wasn't held in Paris or Milan. It was held in the open courtyard of the former French governor's palace in Decada, the very seat of the power the cloth had once secretly defied. The guest list was a fascinating mix. The international fashion elite, Senegalese dignitaries, and most importantly, seated in the front row were the elderly weavers who had helped with the decoding. They were dressed in their own finest traditional weaves, their presence a testament to the living history of the craft. As the show began, the atmosphere was electric. The dramatic runway was set against the historic backdrop of the governor's palace courtyard. Then the first model appeared, walking with grace and power, wearing Katie's stunning protest pattern gown. And in the front row, an elderly weaver woman watched, her hand rising to her heart as tears welled in her eyes. It was a moment of profound connection, a circle closing across generations. The secret language of her ancestors was being spoken, not in hushed tones, but celebrated on a world stage. As the models walked the runway, a quiet narration accompanied the music, explaining the story behind each pattern. The show notes provided the same incredible details. The audience quickly realized they weren't just watching a fashion show. They were receiving a history lesson, an archaeological report, and a profound act of cultural reclamation all at once. You could hear audible gasps in the crowd as the hidden meanings were revealed. These colonial patterns, once symbols of oppression and forced erasure, were being transformed before their very eyes. They became symbols of incredible resilience, of quiet intelligence, reclaimed and elevated to the highest form of art. It was a masterclass in how to honor the past while striding confidently into the future. For the finale, Katie herself walked out onto the runway. But she wasn't alone. She walked holding the hands of two of the oldest weavers, the keepers of this sacred knowledge. The message was unmistakable and deeply moving. This was not the work of a single designer's genius. This was the culmination of a century of silent knowledge, a legacy held in the hands of women, now finally being spoken aloud for all the world to hear. The loom's whisper had become a declaration. The threads of the past had been picked up, not to merely replicate what was, but to weave a new, conscious future, a future that remembered its own story, stitch by deliberate stitch. Let's just pause for a moment and take that in. Imagine the scene, the powerful circle closing, the once silenced loom finding its voice again, its story echoing not in a dusty village shed, but on a global stage. The secret, once a tool for survival, was now revealed as a source of immense strength and pride. The cloth had finally completed its mission. It had kept the truth safe for generations, waiting patiently until its people were ready to hear it, ready to wear it, ready to celebrate it. And so, the rhythmic clack-clack-clack that began our story finds its echo in a new rhythm, the steady beat of a modern city. The bright flash of camera lights on a runway, and the excited, racing pulse of rediscovery. Our journey with the weavers of the Wolof villages is drawing to a close, right here, by the calming, glowing embers of our fire. We've traveled a long way together, haven't we? We've seen how a simple loom can become a classroom, a sacred space where 4 generations of a family could teach and learn, sharing knowledge in a silent, tangible language of thread. We stood in awe before the profound honesty of the funeral cloth, a woven biography that didn't shy away from the complexities of a human life, embracing every triumph, every sorrow, the full, unvarnished spectrum. It was more than fabric. It was a final, truthful statement. We also felt that chilling silence, that sense of loss when cheap foreign cloth flooded the markets, threatening to completely erase that ancient, beautiful language. It was a moment of crisis, a cultural near-death experience. But then, we marveled at the ingenious and courageous response that followed. We witnessed the birth of a secret history, a quiet war of whispers woven directly into the weft and warp of their textiles. Patterns became codes, symbols became shields, preserving their heritage in plain sight, hidden from those who sought to dismantle it. And what a celebration it was, that moment of decoding, when a new generation, armed not with weapons, but with magnifying glasses, deep respect, and a burning curiosity, leaned in close to listen. They heard the whispers of their ancestors and helped them ring out once more, transforming them into a clear, proud, and defiant song for the whole world to hear. This remarkable story of the Wolof weavers is a powerful testament, a living proof that true knowledge, the kind that is lived and breathed, rather than merely written down in a book, has an incredible power to endure. It shows us that culture is not some static object to be placed in a museum case behind glass. No, it's a living, breathing, adapting intelligence. It's a dynamic force, and when it's attacked, when it's threatened, it possesses the remarkable ability to go underground, to hide in plain sight, and to preserve its very essence in code, waiting for the right moment. And when that time is right, as we've seen, it can re-emerge, not as a dusty relic of a bygone era, but as a vibrant, vital force, ready to shape and enrich the present. Katie Diop's groundbreaking work, her passion and dedication, reminds us of a fundamental truth. The past is not a weight that holds us down. It's not a burden, it is a loom, rich with threads of wisdom, experience, and identity. We are the weavers of now. We stand before that loom every single day. We can choose to ignore the threads of history, to let them fray and be forgotten. Or we can do as Katie did. We can pick them up, feel their texture, understand their strength and their story, and then, with intention and skill, weave them into the very fabric of our future. The Wolof weavers teach us a lesson that extends far beyond cloth. They show us that every pattern we create has a meaning, that every thread we choose has a direction, and that what we make together, whether it's cloth, a community, or a shared culture, can be a thing of both breathtaking beauty and profound, unshakable truth. It's about the intention we bring to our craft, to our lives. As the last, warm glow of our fire begins to fade, succumbing to the vast, velvet darkness of the night, let the final image that stays with you be one of hands. Think of old, wrinkled hands, repositories of ancient knowledge, and young, eager hands, full of new energy, touching the very same piece of cloth. Together, they are reading the same story, understanding the same silent, powerful language that has been passed down through time. The loom itself may change, evolving from wood and string to digital design and global runways. But the fundamental human need to weave our world with intention, with memory, and with meaning that remains constant. That is our shared thread. The night is deep now, and the air is still. The story is complete. Thank you for joining us here. You are under Biographies. We'll see you on the next journey.